The Origin of Jazz, a New Orleans Story. My name is Miles Boone. I'm a senior at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. I'm pursuing a BFA in jazz and contemporary music, and this research project is a replacement for my jazz history credit. But I also have a keen interest in the city of New Orleans and in jazz music, obviously. Jazz, the name given to the music that originated in New Orleans around the beginning of the 20th century and developed through various increasingly complex styles, generally marked by intricate propulsive rhythms, polyphonic ensembles, improvisation, virtuosic solos, melodic freedom, and a broad harmonic idiom. The term jazz, before it was used to define the genre of music, meant to speed up. Its Spanish root, jism, means to ejaculate. The 2 decades of syncretism in which jazz developed are between 1896 and 1917. In 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal court case legalized segregation. The Bolden Band began parading in New Orleans. Louis Armstrong, Emma Barrett, Sidney Bechet, Lonnie Johnson, and Clarence Williams were all born after 1896 but before 1900. And in 1897, Storyville is implemented. All in 1917, the United States enters World War I. Storyville is shut down. The Dixieland Jazz Band recorded their first records and released them, which was the first time that many Americans heard jazz. Jelly Roll Morton, the pianist, goes to Hollywood, and the term jazz shows up for the first time. New Orleans was founded by French colonists in 1718. Early colonists struggled with the environment, particularly hurricanes, flooding, heat, mosquitoes, and apparently fires. This was the case with many European settlers in the Americas. Building homes out of wood was a new concept. There are a few changes of ownership in the city's history. Of course, it was established by the French, but sold to Spain in the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1762. After being reacquired by Napoleon, it was quickly sold to the U.S. in the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Even under different rule, the population majority was almost always been black. This has been the case since the 1720s. Louisiana's system of slavery was also different. The rest of the South banned the use of drums so slaves couldn't send messages to one another. In New Orleans, slaves were permitted to have drums, but also to leave the plantations every Sunday to go to Congo Square and play music and dance. This is Congo Square. It sits in Armstrong Park next to the Mahalia Jackson Theater. Congo Square is where slaves congregated before the Civil War to make music. There are reports of drum circles, string ensembles, choirs, and dancers at Congo Square. It attracted tourists from all over the country. I took this picture and most of the pictures in this slideshow during 2 trips to New Orleans, once in January and once in March, right before Mardi Gras and right after. The events of Congo Square came to a halt after the Civil War. Many were able to procure old instruments, specifically horns that were owned by military marching band musicians from the war. Before and after the Civil War, Creoles of color were considered prominent members of society, and the term Creole means a person of European blood born in the New World. This term comes from the Spanish caste system, the same one that the terms mulatto and Negro are from. These are terms that Creoles probably did not want to be associated with, which may be why many Creoles of color looked down upon black communities. New Orleans was always a diverse, cosmopolitan city. There were strong German, Irish, and Italian presences, as well as black and Creole. For most of the 1800s, minstrelsy, a blackface performance art, was the most popular form of entertainment in America. But during Reconstruction, ragtime and the blues began to emerge as new art forms. as musicians with their wind instruments began playing the blues on horns. As Jim Crow laws were set in place to keep blacks from voting, it gave a new meaning to having the blues. In 1890, Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act, declaring it illegal for blacks and whites to travel in the same train car. As an experiment surmised by a group of white liberals and distinguished Creoles of color, Homer Adolph Plessy, this man on the left, purchases a train ticket and sits in a whites only car. He's arrested, tried, and found guilty quite quickly. The Supreme Court upheld the original conviction. Separate but equal facilities are constitutional, apparently. This ruling made Creoles into Negroes overnight, societally and musically. After this decision, the blues and classical virtuosity were brought together. Storyville, or the Red Light District, was established in 1897. It was named after the alderman Sidney Story, who wrote the legislation. It was an area of 12 square blocks near the French Quarter where prostitution was legal and gambling was ever present. Many musicians played in its clubs, pleasure houses, and cabarets nightly. Storyville was bossed by Tom Anderson, and his club was called City Hall. Anderson also published the Blue Book, which had detailed lists of all the prostitutes and the best entertainers and illustrations of the most popular venues. Tourists could purchase the Blue Book for only 25 cents. Lulu White was one of the more popular madams of Storyville, and her club was called Mahogany Hall. Peter Lala ran the 25 Club, where musicians had after-hours jams similar to those at Minton's in New York, headed by Thelonious Monk and Dizzy Gillespie. In 1910, there was a reported 200 pleasure houses in Storyville, along with 9 cabarets. At this time, Billy Phillips decided to put some class into his cabaret called the Tuxedo. He implemented fixed gambling in favor of the house, always, raised prices, hired orchestras, more entertainers, and things were going well. But after a gunfight in 1913, Phillips was killed in his own club. After this, the police would begin to crack down on Storyville. Most of the buildings in Storyville were torn down during the Great Depression. Now what's here is mostly apartments. And these are quite nice, actually. I conducted a few interviews in March when I was there. The Origin of Jazz, a New Orleans Story. My name is Mike. This building, which is now the Basin Supermarket, was Lulu White's Mahogany Hall. The Origin of Jazz, a New Orleans Story. My name is Mike. Charles Buddy Bolden was the first star of the jazz world, even though back in his day it was still just the blues. Bolden ran a barbershop. His band rehearsed in the back room. Bolden also edited and published The Cricket, a gossip tabloid with his friend named Spider, who was employed, probably as a snitch, by the police. He began playing in parades around 1895. A parade could employ around 15 different bands. It's no secret Bolden struggled with addiction to alcohol and women. That, coupled with overwork and mental health issues, drove Bolden into insanity. He was committed in 1909 to Jackson Hospital in Jackson, Louisiana. Bolden lived in the asylum until he died in 1931. He was buried in an unmarked grave at Holt Cemetery. Some people believe that Jackson Hospital wasn't entirely focused on rehabilitation, as it was one of the city's largest employers and hosted events like parades, dances, and weddings even. In the late 80s, archivist and professor of jazz studies at the University of New Orleans, Donald Marquise, began doing research on the late Bolden. He was on the committee that planned Bolden's jazz funeral and paid for his headstone. In this picture, you can see Buddy Bolden's obituary. Yes, that date is correct. Friday, September 6th, 1996 was when Buddy Bolden received his jazz funeral. This is Buddy's tombstone. This is Holt Cemetery. It's predominantly African American cemetery, and it's one of the only in-ground cemeteries in New Orleans that is still present from this time. Some call it the low-budget cemetery. The hottest thing in New Orleans after the Bolden Band was Freddie Keppard and the Olympia Band. Keppard had a background as a violinist. This probably made him popular amongst different communities, even though he could not read music. The nucleus from the Olympia Band would go on to form the original Creole Band, the first important band to leave New Orleans. George Baquet, who was in Bolden Band, was also a member of the original Creole Band and the only one who could read music. So on a gig, Baquet would play a straight, low melody that everyone could hang on to, while Keppard, who was known for his high notes, embellished in upper registers. One time on a gig in Shreveport, Louisiana, Bill Johnson, the stringed bassist for the original Creole Band, broke his bow, so he decided to pluck his instrument for the remainder of the set. This resulted in such a novel, swinging effect that he slapped his bass for the rest of his career, and everyone loved it. Many others would follow in his footsteps, or finger steps. This is a picture of the Bolden Band. Next to the bassist, you can see Buddy Bolden holding his cornet. And down in the right corner sitting is George Baquet with his clarinet. This is a mural of that same picture, but this is on the backside of the Little Jim Saloon on Rampart Street in downtown New Orleans. Apparently, this is a place where Bolden and many other jazz greats played gigs. It's shut down right now, and no one knows when it's going to be opening back up. Jelly Roll Morton, born Joseph Ferdinand Lamoth, began working in Storyville as a teen. Jelly Roll identified with his Creole European ancestry, but his mother was an unwed black woman who traced her lineage back as far as Haiti. He proclaimed that he invented jazz with something he called the Spanish tinge, which was really just habanero dance rhythms. Many of his compositions became jazz standards in New Orleans, including Peephole Blues, which was a favorite in Storyville. Jelly Roll left New Orleans to Hollywood to compose for films in 1917. Willie "Bunk" Johnson is considered to be the true successor to Buddy Bolden. They both played in a low, bluesy style. Bunk was also popular amongst different crowds because of his lightning speed. He actually played in the Bolden Band for 3 years after his first gig. It was easy for him to leave that band because every single time he'd play a wrong note, his band leader would smack his horn out of his mouth. Bunk Johnson was also a teacher to Louis Armstrong and Joe Oliver, and would steal music from Joe. Johnson was one of the first jazzers who actually could read music that frowned upon playing written music. And Johnson is also one of the major sources that we have today on Buddy Bolden. King Joseph Oliver got his start in a children's brass band. Apparently, this band went on tour without any parental consent. They headed straight up the Mississippi to Baton Rouge and ran into trouble with gangs of river bullies. Oliver did grow up to become quite a popular cornetist. He played in the house band at Lala's Cabaret, and he was close with Louis Armstrong. After Oliver left for Chicago, he made sure that Armstrong was his replacement at Lala's, and he sent for Armstrong once he was in Chicago. Once Armstrong got to Chicago, he introduced him to his wife, Lil Hardin. Oliver had a short career as a music publisher, which Lil Hardin helped him with. He did this so that others wouldn't steal his music. They did it anyway. As Oliver got older, people began to forget who he was. He had made a name for himself, once in New Orleans, then in Chicago, and eventually in New York. He tried to go on tour, and it was just not respected as he was before in his earlier days. He had troubles with tour buses, he had trouble with people paying him, he had a lot of musicians sweating him for money. And he died in Savannah, Georgia in 1938. There were several correspondences between him and his siblings right before his death, and he was just saying that he didn't have enough money to make it down to New Orleans. The roles of women in New Orleans discouraged the playing of instruments. There are exceptions for the piano and the clarinet, but most women were restricted to singing and dancing. Creoles of colors identified with Victorian values, and Victorian values definitely excluded women from musical activity. Even at Congo Square, women sang and danced, but often never played drums or the gourd string instruments. Unfortunately, the development of jazz was almost exclusively masculine. Sweet Emma Barrett was one of the pioneers, though. She played with Louis Armstrong in the Tuxedo Band. Mahalia Jackson, although born later, was a star in the 20s alongside Louis Armstrong in the gospel movement. Also, blues singers such as Lizzie Miles and Bessie Smith were performing all around the South. There was definitely more of a niche for women in the genre of blues. With the United States' involvement in the Great War, major shifts occur. The war, aside from constant lynchings, is a major catalyst for the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North. The Navy also shuts down Storyville in November of 1917 because they need to occupy the ports. Jazz also travels globally. The military sent a lot of musicians overseas to play for soldiers to boost morale, and there were a lot of drafted soldiers who could afford to pay musicians privately, so they flew them out to where they were stationed. My goal in this project is to provide a clear narrative of some of the major events that led to the popularization of what we know as jazz. It has been influenced by multiple cultures, capitalism, and true pain. It truly is an expressive American art form. While jazz has changed over time, New Orleans has stayed New Orleans, dirty, busy, and rich with inspiration. The early giants, such as Bolden, Bunk Johnson, Freddie Keppard, and King Oliver, suffered enough and paved the way for other artists so that someone like Louis Armstrong could even exist. To my listeners and readers, I say, take a trip to New Orleans and listen, listen, listen. There are early recordings of many of these great artists. So many people are unclear about what New Orleans sounds like. Investigate for yourselves. You'll see that the sound of the bayou is romantic, tragic, and comical. Thank you for listening. This is Miles Boone.